Today we're looking at Jesus' teaching that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, that you can move mountains. When you first hear that, that's pretty exciting stuff to think that if you just make your faith strong enough that you can remove any obstacles. The problem is, as you get older and older, you have more and more life experiences, the more you realize that you can't move mountains, at least not right away. And so you begin to feel pretty crummy about yourself, thinking, well, I must not have even the faith of a mustard seed if I can't heal these horrible diseases I see all around, if I can't help people be happier, if I can't even sometimes solve my own problems. Maybe I'm not such a good person after all. And I don't think that's where Jesus is coming from. I think when we see this story, this parable, saying if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll be able to move mountains. It says that the mustard seed is the smallest seed which grows into the greatest tree, and that the birds of the air can make their nests there. Well, none of that's true of a mustard plant. And what I would suggest is we're looking at an earlier parable from the East that Jesus is borrowing and plugging in his own culture. In the East, there are stories of the banyan tree, which is a symbol of the tree of life. And it makes a whole lot more sense when you're talking about a banyan tree, because the banyan tree seed is incredibly small, and yet it grows in this vast, vast tree. And more kind of mysterious than that, the roots intertwine so that it becomes this common life. It's a tremendous symbol of the tree of life. And I think that Jesus wants to use that metaphor, but there's no point in talking about banyan trees in Israel. That's kind of like singing Frosty the Snowman to people that live in the desert. It's like they may conceptually know what you mean, but parables should be using ordinary, everyday objects that then help understand these deeper truths. So to understand that when Jesus uses the word seed, it's very possible that he's trying to lead us past the words that he's using to the principles of life. At one point, Jesus says that that his words are like a seed, which I think is very interesting. And then at another point, he says the seed has to die when it goes into the ground. And I think this is very possibly a very profound teaching that literalism will never get you to deep spiritual truths. And it's going to help answer the question why people like Jesus and Buddha are speaking in parables and riddles and this kind of thing. We want them just to say, what do you mean? Say it plainly in English. King James English, preferably. And what we don't realize is that Buddha and Jesus don't give us that literal truth, because that would rob us of what they are trying to give us, which is us understanding the principles of life as we live them out, to understand them from the inside out, not as given to us by an enlightened being, but as something we see, hear, taste, touch, and live out. If you took me to a field of diamonds, I wouldn't know what I was looking at. I mean, I would be looking for those little polished gems with the, polished facets and that kind of thing. And I would walk right by the diamonds and not recognize them. Same thing with gold, probably, I would think. That I wouldn't know how to recognize things in their seed form. And I think that's what Jesus and Buddha are trying to help us do, to realize that what we're looking for is not going to look like our image in our mind. That the seed form of wisdom may look like affliction. It may look like a problem. It may not feel at all very good to eat the seeds, to take in the seeds that will lead us to the tree of life. I think the reason Jesus may be choosing the mustard seed for his image is the same reason that Buddha used that image, to appeal both to the heart and to the mind. When we hear that saying that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, we tend to think about the mind, to say if you believe the teachings of Christianity, then you'll be able to do these miraculous kinds of things. I don't think that's where Jesus is coming from. Buddha told a story of a mustard seed that I think can be very helpful, possibly in understanding where Jesus is coming from. In Buddha's story, and this is told about Buddha, and it's a legend. I don't think it happened in this way, because I think it'd be very cruel if it happened in this way. A woman loses her child. Now, I can't imagine a greater grief than that. In my years and years of ministry, when parents lose their children, that wounds them in a way unlike, I think, anything else that I know of that happens. There may be other correlates to that, but there's something so cruel and unfair, and it feels unnatural about someone dying so early, so young. And a lot of religious people try to make excuses for that at the literal surface level of experience and say, well, God was doing this or God was doing that. And if you've ever been to funerals where the preacher did that, it probably wounded your heart at some level. That's not what Buddha is going to be doing in this story. This is a story to be told after you've healed a little bit. So if you've lost someone or if you're in depression, again, this is something to put in the freezer for now, or at least to store it in the back of your mind. I'm not asking you not to go through your grief and trauma. But I think there is something helpful here and hopeful here. And it's telling us that things won't always be as bad as they feel in that moment. So the woman comes to Buddha and says, I've lost my child. Is there anything that can heal this wound? And I think there are different versions of the story. Some of it's resuscitating the child. But in terms of the symbol, the parable, it's like, how do you heal the wounds of life? When something cannot be reconciled. When a child dies, when you lose the job you always wanted to have, when you fail in a relationship that you thought was going to be lifelong. What happens when we can't make life work at the literal level anymore? So what Buddha says is, yes, there is a healing medicine, but what I need you to do is to go and find me one mustard seed. Of course, the woman's very excited now. One mustard seed is going to heal this tremendous grief and pain that she's going through. As she starts to leave, Buddha gives the kind of footnote to it, saying, but it needs to come from a house that has known no sorrow. Obviously, you wouldn't do that to someone who has just had their heart torn out. This is a legend, a teaching story. So the woman goes out looking for a mustard seed from a house that has known no sorrow. As she listens to one heartbreaking story after another, she begins to realize that her grief is not just her grief alone, that her grief is a part of the human condition. She's understanding what Buddha is trying to say about impermanence. And ultimately, she becomes enlightened and becomes this, gift-giving being, because now she has a context to put her grief. Her grief isn't gone. She hasn't come up with some fake story about how life is fair or that God took the child to do something or to teach her a lesson. Instead, the story is being reframed from what has happened to her to what could happen through her. And that's the seed, the principle of life. Something happening through us, I think, that Jesus and Buddha are trying to put us in touch with. The mustard seed, I could be completely wrong about this, but in looking back, what I try to do is go back and look at the cultures of the time. Alexander the Great used to send mustard seeds to his the enemies that he'd conquered and said, I'm sending you these mustard seeds so you can taste the bitterness of my victory. That's an outstanding guy. So Jesus may not be choosing the mustard seed randomly. The story doesn't work on the idea of the mustard seed being the smallest seed and becoming the biggest plant. But it works magnificently if what he's saying is the seed that leads to this common life, to this, our version of enlightenment, salvation, whatever it means, may taste very bitter at the time. It may taste like loneliness. It may taste like failure. And what happens is when we stop thinking of our life as ours, when we stop thinking of our pain as ours, when we stop thinking of our failure as ours alone, we enter into the common life. That the mind can grow fairly painlessly, but the heart can only grow by breaking. The little loves disappoint us, and we grow into the larger loves. And that's a very painful and beautiful lesson about life, that outgrowing our smaller loves can be very disappointing, very disillusioning, but it's never the last word, because our hearts break open to a larger world. It's like a stream that's thinking everything that's happening to it is personal, a personal insult, not realizing it's flowing to the common life, that it's always been the common life, that the narrowness of its experience, the narrowness of its awareness is what makes it think that it's separate and alone, and that all these things are happening to it. That ultimately salvation, enlightenment, or the stream flowing into the ocean is coming to the common life. And to realize it may not feel good in its seed form. It may feel horrible in its seed form. What the parable is trying to do, I think, is to shift our awareness from what's happening to us to what is happening through us. That the stories of death, crucifixion, resurrection, I don't think are talking just about our small life. The pain is about our small life. The crucifixion is about our ego. But the resurrection is into the common life, into nature, into life, into this universal love that weaves us together. Frederick Buechner, the great preacher, talked about gospel as tragedy, comedy, and fairy tale. Sometimes you have to say things in poetry for people to find themselves. As long as you're saying it literally, as long as you're sounding like the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's really hard for people to find their poetry, their wisdom, their art. So this is what Frederick Buechner said. He said, people are prepared for a God who strikes hard bargains, but not for a God who gives as much for an hour's work as for a day's labor. That's from a different parable. He said, they're prepared for a mustard seed kingdom of God, no bigger than the eye of a newt, but not for the great banyan it becomes with birds in its branches, singing Mozart. They are prepared for the potluck supper at First Presbyterian, but not for the marriage supper of the Lamb. This is somebody who knows how to use cultural poetry, the poetry of Christianity, to talk about the dance of life. We need a Christianity that's bigger than our sect. We need a Christianity that's bigger than literalism, that's bigger than religion. It needs to be one where we recognize the Buddhas, Muhammad's, the atheists are all parts of the human family. And they're all singing Mozart at some level, if our hearts are in tune. And the way we get there is to realize that what's happening in the world isn't just happening to us alone. It's not just happening to me, it's happening to you and me, to us, and to the world at large. It's very different when I realize my pain is not my pain alone. When I realize what I'm experiencing is the human condition, then my pain can actually bring me closer to you, to care more about you, to feel that your pain is just as wounding to you as mine is to me. And then the pain begins to transform into something else. It doesn't make it fair. It doesn't even necessarily make it worth it in terms of your own personal life. But in terms of the common life, it makes a magnificent difference for us to realize that this thing that wounds us may be just the first word. If we realize that we're eating bitter fruit that blossoms into a much greater plant, a plant that the birds can come and nest on, and the roots intersect with every other being on the planet. That even the bitterest seed can be the beginning of wisdom, beauty, and goodness. I think what Jesus is saying in a nutshell is what happens to us is never as important as what is happening through us. Thank you for listening and being here this morning. I invite you now to your own reflections on these words.